Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Pedro Acevedo del Federal Contracting Center. Muchas gracias por la oportunidad y por estar con nosotros durante la tarde de hoy. Vamos a dar comienzo en los próximos 2 o 3 minutos para permitir que unas personas que nos faltan que pueden entrar. Pero primero que todo, le queremos agradecer en cantidad por la oportunidad que nos están dando durante la tarde de hoy. Esperamos que esta actividad sea de gran beneficio para ustedes. Bueno, vamos a comenzar oficialmente el taller de hoy. Como ustedes saben, el taller lo vamos a dividir en 2 partes. La primera parte va a ser la presentación de la licenciada Nicole Pottroff. Ella va a estar presentando todo lo relacionado al programa de Ochoa. La licenciada Pottroff es una persona, como ustedes pudieron ver en su biografía, una persona que su práctica legal es solamente, exclusivamente y de todo su bufete de abogado en todo lo relacionado a contratación federal. Y dentro de eso, pues es experta en todas las certificaciones. La segunda parte del taller, para las personas que estén interesadas en comenzar el proceso de la certificación Ochoa, pues la segunda parte del taller, una vez Nicole finalice, entonces vamos a comenzar ya a nivel de laboratorio y lo vamos a dividir, tanto las personas que están virtual, van a pasar con nuestra compañera Ada Santos, Rey Torres, Adriana Carón y Magali Flores, para trabajar la parte, para que ustedes puedan comenzar lo que deseen, la presentación virtual. Y tenemos un grupo que va a estar aquí presencialmente, que lo vamos a trabajar acá ya de forma presencial. La presentación de Nicole está tanto en español como en inglés, y la misma se le va a hacer llegar a todos ustedes, ya se nos autorizó, la misma se le va a hacer llegar a todos ustedes una vez finalice. La presentación se la vamos a hacer llegar por correo electrónico. Las preguntas las vamos a dejar para el final. No obstante, cualquier pregunta que ustedes tengan la pueden poner en el chat, lo vamos a estar monitoreando. Las preguntas las pueden hacer en español, las pueden hacer en inglés. Nicole habla español, Nicole habla inglés. Va a estar ofreciendo la presentación en inglés, pero cualquier pregunta, cualquier duda. Si no hablan muy rápido, estoy seguro que Nicole lo va a entender. Si hablan bien rápido en español, como hablo yo, pues simplemente nosotros hacemos la traducción acá. Así que con esto, simplemente les solicito a todos que se mantengan en mute. Preguntas a través del chat. Y cuando finalicemos, pues también simplemente le quitan el mute y pueden hacer la pregunta directamente si así lo desean. Con esto dicho, Nicole, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much. You still mute. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And it's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here. Estoy muy emocionante. So very excited today. As Pedro mentioned, I'm going to be doing majority in Spanish. I did go ahead and include some, or in English, and it did include some Spanish translation to the best of my ability. And again, questions in Spanish, as long as you go nice and slow, I should be all right. And I've got some wonderful assistance if needed. Without further ado, let's get started. This is a very exciting presentation, both because I love Spanish. It's a far superior language to English. And I can tell you that easily as someone that speaks both. And I also love the 8A program so much. It's one of my very favorite topics to speak on, and I'm so excited to be speaking to you all about it today. So thank you again so much for having me. SBA's 8A Business Development Program is the long name for the 8A program. I'll pretty much call it 8A program throughout, but that's the full name of what SBA calls it. That's me. As you can see, I am an equity partner. And I meant to change that to la presentadora. Lo siento. That's one that got by me, that the masculine and feminine is always one that I have to think harder about because we don't have that in English. but I'll fix that. Anyways, that's me. I'm a partner here at Prince Nicole Pottroff. That is my law firm. I'm the Pottroff in Prince Nicole Pottroff. We are a federal government contracting firm in Kansas. We are near Kansas City, and we do only federal government contracting. So we do everything from litigation, SBA, GAO, Court of Federal Claims. I've got one case currently that's actually in front of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, which, if that were to get appealed again, would go to the Supreme Court of the United States. So we get to do some really cool litigation, but we also do a lot of the, what I prefer, the boring transactional work, subcontracts and joint ventures and all that stuff. We also do the 8A program, the WSB program, the SDVOSB for veterans, Hub Zone, all of those. And all wonderful programs. I've seen so many businesses succeed tremendously when getting into these programs and really increase their revenue and capabilities tremendously in just a year. So I am very excited that I get to share some of this info with you all today. Before I get started, this is our GovCon handbook. This is the 8A program one. We have lots of these, but this one is all about the 8A program. And it is in English, but it is in very plain English, not legalese, not fancy lawyer talk. It's very simple, easy to read. It's supposed to be that way. We want the information to be accessible to everybody. You can get it on Amazon, as it says right there. Or if you reach out to me, I'm more than happy to send you all a copy. So you just reach out to me via email. My email's there on the bottom right-hand side of the slides. I will gladly send you a copy. Okay, very quickly going to go over the presentation. Before we get started, we talked a little bit about this already, but I'm excited. I said that already, right? Emocionante. This is the kind of general English version of the presentation. Happy to answer questions in Spanish. Happy if you want to email me. I can also answer questions in Spanish or English. If you do have a question that you want to ask in Spanish and you already know what it's going to be during the presentation, please put it in the chat for me. In Spanish is fine, but being able to read it often helps me when I'm trying to translate. But yes, putting it in the chat or the chatear, fantastic. That'll help me a lot if you do have a question ahead of time. But if not, ask it when it comes to you. And then, yes, bear with me. Please be patient. I studied Spanish in college a long time ago. I love to practice Spanish. I've never been to Puerto Rico, although we're going to make that happen. I've been to Mexico probably 10 times, and I know Spanish is different everywhere you go. So bear with me again if it's not quite perfect on your Q&A. And if there's anything that's not translated that you would like a translation, please put that in the box as well. Between Pedro and everyone else, I'm sure somebody will be able to answer you even if I'm talking. And if not, I will jump in and answer you when I can. Also, before we get started, this is just kind of general lawyer stuff. This is not legal advice. It is general guidance information on the law, but it's not personalized individual legal advice. So even if it sounds like I'm just perfectly talking to you and your company, and I've made an analogy to something that's very relatable, keep in mind that if you wanted personalized legal advice, reach out to me separate and we can talk about setting up a call with your clients, you, anyone, so that we can do that personalized thing. Also, keep in mind that the rules today, ahora, the rules are the ones that I'm talking about. They change a lot. And especially in the current landscape, we're seeing some rapid changes in the rules. So if you are listening to the recording of this later on, please do keep in mind that some of the rules may have changed. And if you're unsure about any of those, again, shoot me an email. I am so happy to get emails after these. I will answer as time allows, but more than happy to tell you whether or not a rule has changed or whether it's the same rule if you email me about it. So we're going to start with the 8A program overview. Just generally, what is it? What are the major rules? How does it work? Then we're going to talk about eligibility. There's lots of different requirements there. We're going to go through all of them. I'm going to focus especially hard on the social disadvantage narrative. Pedro told me there was some interest in discussing the narrative and specific to Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans, those living in Puerto Rico, ways that we could establish social disadvantage. I've been doing a lot of brainstorming. I even talked to a friend from Puerto Rico for quite some time. He gave me some great ideas, and I'm excited to share them with you all. And then finally, we'll talk about the application itself and how that works, what the timelines look like, procedures, all that good stuff, just some helpful pro tips as well. Oh, and just so you're aware, if there is, so I've translated in italics, I've translated everything to Spanish. However, if I use the same term for multiple slides, I've only translated it on the first slide. So if there is something that you need translated, just pop back a couple slides and it will be there in Spanish at some point. Okay, start with the big picture purpose. What is the purpose of the 8A program? This rule, this 13 CFR, anything that's 13 CFR is SBA's regulations, if you don't already know that. When you're talking about the CFR, it's a giant group of rules. 48 CFR is the FAR, 13 CFR is SBA's rules. I think it's 4 CFR would be GAO's rules. So we're going to focus mostly, almost solely on SBA's rules today. There's some information in the FAR about the 8A program, but not much relevant to what we're going to speak on today. So that rule says to assist eligible small disadvantaged business concerns to compete in the American economy through business development. The 8A program is a creature of statute, so it's from a statute, not a regulation. A statute being obviously a congressionally drafted and imposed legislation, while the regulations are the agency's legislation. So this is going to be mostly talking about SBA's regulations, but the 8A program itself comes from a statute. And if you're wondering why that's important, it's very important in today's landscape because we've heard a lot of talk of DEI, and there's been some attacks on DEI, and many think, DEI is going to be lessened, going to go away, diversity, equity, inclusion. But the good thing, the important thing to keep in mind is that there would have to be an act of Congress to actually get rid of the 8A program altogether or make any really significant changes to it. The narrative changes that we'll talk about later, those are not something that was actually in statute, and so they were able to be changed. But the statute itself is what creates the 8A program, so think no massive changes, and it's not going to go away unless Congress says so. So it can't be an act of the president, it can't be an act of the SBA. So the basics of the 8A program. As you're very likely aware, it is managed and administered by the SBA. There is a formal certification requirement. If anyone is interested, there is also the small disadvantaged business self-certification, which is essentially a self-certification of 8A minus 1 or 2 of the requirements that you don't have to meet for SDB and you do for 8A. So if you're wondering, because you thought there was a self-certification option, that would be the SDB program. It is very similar, and a lot of the allocated federal dollars are just allocated for the small disadvantaged business category as a whole, which is why it is often kind of conflated with 8A, but they are separate programs. They just go after, they can go after the same types of set-asides often. If you qualify as an 8A, you automatically qualify as an SDB. So 8A is obviously the higher bar, the one you want to reach for. The most relevant 8A regulations appear in SBA's rules. I just explained that. Not the FAR, not 48 CFR. There are some things in there. I think there's an 8A limitation on subcontracting maybe that kind of comes up. There's a couple small nuances, but for the most part, it doesn't really talk about 8A much at all. And then it's a 9-year program term. So unlike all of SBA's other programs, this one is limited in time. It is only 9 years. There was an exception during COVID. Many businesses that were affected by COVID and kind of missed some of their program term due to the year of COVID got a 10th year from the SBA. But you had to specifically be given that 10th year. It wasn't an automatic thing. And it's not something we see in the future or we've seen in the past, I guess, hopefully not in the future, barring there not being another pandemic. So yes, it's a limited program term. And for that reason, it's so important that you are ready when you do apply to the 8A program, that you are ready to apply, you're ready to perform 8A contracts, you're ready to start your term. Because I have seen many times people come to me after they've been in the 8A program for a year or two saying, I'm not getting 8A work, I'm not sure what's going on. It was supposed to be this great program, and really we're not seeing a whole lot from it. That does happen. And there's a lot of good pieces of advice I can give, lots of good other types of assistance you can take from the SBA, from mentors, things like that. So keep in mind, that's always important to be ready when you start. And once you do, if you are ready, you can really start utilizing the full program within the first year. And that's great. Participation ends at the term completion. So you're done at the end of 9 years, you're done. Or you could be terminated, or you can be early graduated. Generally, early graduated or early graduation is one of those things where you exceed one of the thresholds for finances or something like that. It's supposed to be kind of a good thing, or maybe your company is not small anymore. Generally, they use that to say you've succeeded, you've had success in the 8A program, and thus you're being graduated. You don't need the 8A program anymore. However, I have had clients that have basically had exactly that happen, but they've been told they were being terminated versus graduated. So just kind of an important distinction to keep in mind. It used to be a lot more clean cut for me, early graduation versus termination. They kind of blur those lines now. Generally, I don't love the word terminated. I don't love the word termination when it comes to my client statuses. So I will always push back on SBA a little if it's one of those things and say, can we please call this an early graduation? Because that's technically what it is. So that's something you should do, can do. It's not like a termination is going to be a big mark on your record for something like 8A, but to me, termination implies that you've done something wrong, and you absolutely have not if you've just succeeded and now don't meet the thresholds anymore. We'll talk about those thresholds too, don't worry. Benefits of the 8A program. Not going to spend much on this because I think you all are well aware, or you probably would not be here today. We do have a very robust direct award sole source program in the 8A program. Much more robust than any of the other certification programs. 8A just does a lot more sole sourcing. There's some really great rules that 8A can rely on that others don't. You have set aside contracts for 8As that you're able to compete for. You have SDB, subcontracting credit for large primes. Again, SDB being small disadvantaged business, you qualify as that if you are 8A. As far as your subcontracting goes, many agencies will give large primes credit and give them subcontracting plans where they have to use small disadvantaged businesses, including 8As, to the greatest extent possible. So it can give you credit even if you are just subcontracting, you're not yet doing those 8A set-asides or sole source awards. And there's also SBA business development assistance. It's in the name of the program. There's a lot of really kind of not so well-known parts of that, which I didn't go into that much today, but if you've got questions on that, let me know. There's things like if the government has surplus, federal government has surplus of certain things that can benefit an 8A firm, the 8A firm has rights to get those. And I cannot recall off the top of my head whether it's either free or significantly discounted for at least some of it. So lots of benefits there people are not even aware of. This is where obviously Apex comes in huge. Your Apex accelerators tell you these things. And a lot of people will go to their Apex accelerators asking about the different types of business development assistants that aren't as well known. Only other thing I'll mention on this slide, another reason the 8A is such a popular thing, even for set-asides, even if you're not going after sole source, is that once 8A, always 8A rule, which basically says that if work has been accepted into the 8A program, for example, let's say you're doing court translation services, and that work has been deemed 8A program work. So 8A companies have been performing this work via contracts over the years. It actually requires a whole process if the agency decides to award that work to a non-8A or to compete that work amongst those that are not 8A. It has to go through this entire removal process. It's not even just the area office. It ends up being other SBA offices have to get involved. There's written justifications. So for that reason, a lot of work that goes into the 8A program never comes back out. And that's why a lot of people are very, very interested in getting into the program to get their hands on that work. That was overview, pretty painless. Here's where we get into the really nitty-gritty stuff. So this is eligibility, and it takes a lot. I'm just going to level with you, obviously. 8A takes a lot of work to be eligible. Lots of changes, even for very, companies that come to me that are wholeheartedly eligible for the 8A program and doing nothing wrong. I still usually end up editing their operating agreements and other documents. I end up helping them with their narratives, making sure their finances meet the thresholds. There's just so many little things. It really can be worth your time to talk to a consultant, an attorney, and obviously Apex out there helping everybody with things like this. All right, so here's the main ones. Notice I put y otros because there are others, but the others are kind of the more nuanced ones that most people don't worry much about. So we're going to focus on these main ones. One, you need to be a small business. So what does that mean, a small business? That's a great question. And I'll answer and ask it. So for the 8A program, it's the only certification program where being small depends on your primary NAICS. And I've got an entire slide on that. We're going to go in more detail, but all the other ones allow you to be small under any NAICS code that you have listed on SAM. So you don't even have to be small under your primary, just under one of your NAICS codes on SAM if you are WOSB, HubZone, SCVOSB, all that stuff. 8A is different. It does depend on your primary NAICS, and we will go into more detail there. You need 51% unconditional and direct ownership and control. I will also talk a little more detail about what unconditional and direct mean, what it means to control, but in a nutshell, you have to own 51%. Keep in mind, it is not that you must own the majority, it is that you must own 51%. I get this question a lot. If I own 50% of the company and the other two people own 25% each, I'm the majority owner, do I qualify? The rule does say 51%. So it is actually not about majority. It is about being a 51% owner. US citizen and resident. So we will talk more about that as well, what qualifies, what doesn't. But that is obviously a big one. And there's really no way around that one if you're not a citizen and you don't reside in the United States. You have to have good character. We'll talk about what that means as well. But for the most part, don't have a bunch of felonies, don't have a bunch of late taxes, haven't been debarred, anything like that. Social disadvantage and economic disadvantage. Don't you worry, we're going to talk a lot about those. And then potential for success. That's one of the more misunderstood ones, I think, out there for purposes of the kind of bigger picture here. Just keep in mind, when we talk about economic disadvantage, we're talking about you as an owner of an 8A company individually. When we talk about potential for success, there's some aspects have to do with you as an owner, but for the most part, it's looking at the potential for your business, for the applicant business to succeed. So that's the biggest thing to kind of keep in mind. A lot of people mix those two up. And then they ask, why do we have one rule saying we can't make too much money and one rule saying we should make good money? It's because they have to do with different aspects of you as an owner individually versus the company. All right. This is the specific SBA rule 124.109 through 11. It's a set of regulations that covers ANCs. Those are Alaskan Native corporations. NHOs, those are Native Hawaiian organizations. CDCs, those are community development corporations. We're not going to talk much about those. I will tell you, in all of my experience, I don't think I've yet to assist a CDC. I think we had one a while back as a client, but I don't think I personally did anything with them. So, and then Native American tribes. Also, all of these have special 8A rules, and we will talk a little bit about those, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. So if you do have questions about where the tribal, I'm just generally going to call these the tribal owned rules, tribal owned regulations, where they differ, feel free to reach out. In a nutshell, big picture, the main differences are You only establish economic disadvantage for the tribe itself. Once a tribe or an Alaska Native organization, Native Hawaiian organization, once the tribe itself has established it is economically disadvantaged, all of the companies opened under that tribe that pursue 8A are also just considered economically disadvantaged. Potential for success is a little different because the tribe basically just has to back the company saying, we will financially back this 8A company, and they attest that to SBA. And then social disadvantage is one that the tribe does not have to necessarily show. It is just, and it's not a presumption of social disadvantage. Keep that in mind. We'll talk more about it in a little bit, but it is established via like treaty and relationship. It is not something that comes from the bias and all the other stuff that is typical to the individual regulations, the individual owned 8As. Jump right into size. So I did spoil this one a wee bit, but 8A company needs to be small under its primary North American industry classification system code. Yes, that's a mouthful. That is the NAICS code. And quick little pro tip, because people get this wrong all the time. NAICS code, NAICS, NAICS code is pronounced NAICS. It rhymes with snakes. I have heard all kinds of different pronunciations. That one is correct, I promise you. Just having that correct is already browning points with me anytime I'm talking with someone because it is very commonly misspoken. So primary industry is defined in 13 CFR 121-107. So basically, you have to pick a primary industry, and you can't just roll the die and pick one. You have to actually pick the one that most closely aligns with your history, your financial history, your contract history, being able to show that your taxes match your primary NAICS, primary revenues coming from that primary industry, being able to show that that primary industry it properly covers the contracts, not all of them, but majority of the contracts you performed. You can have a lot of different NAICS codes that you perform under, and your SAM can list hundreds. For 8A program purposes, very important that you know which one is your primary and that you correctly tell SBA that is your primary NAICS code and the one you're going to be pursuing 8A program participation under. So that is one aspect of being small for the 8A program. There is another. The second part of it is that you must also be small for any 8A set aside solicitation or 8A sole source contracts solicitation. It's not really a solicitation, it's more just a contract, but sometimes you'll get some kind of preliminary document. Whatever those say is the size standard assigned to the NAICS code assigned to the contract or solicitation, that is a second prong. You must be small under both. That seems to make sense perfectly when I say it to people, but in reality, if you think about it, the confusion arises because people get into the 8A program because let's say they have a construction NAICS code and it's like a $41 million size standard. And they say, we're definitely small under our primary NAICS code, which is construction. But let's say that they go after something that's a bit more specialized type of construction and that NAICS code is a little smaller. So let's say 20 million a year. Very often people come to me with confusion because they think, wait, I am eligible to bid on 8A work. I'm an 8A contractor. I'm small under my primary NAICS code. I should be able to bid on any 8A contracts that I want. But that is not the case. So even with an 8A, even matching that set aside status, you still have to be small. And this is the case with every SBA certification program out there. If you're a hub zone, you don't just qualify for every hub zone award, you have to also be small for those awards. So important distinction to keep in mind because there is a lot of confusion there. But not anything difficult, just one where I do see some confusion. And then SBA size and affiliation rules apply. So the affiliation rules and the size rules are all found in part 121. I believe affiliation is 121-103. I think size is 121-104 through 107. Basically, it's important because if you have an affiliate under SBA's affiliation and size rules. So if it's a wholly owned subsidiary, or a wholly owned, or like a sister company, those types of companies are deemed affiliates. And that's not a big deal when it comes to size. as long as they're small, as long as if you aggregate those companies, they're still small. Where it is important for 8A is anytime there is an affiliate of an 8A company, SBA will dig into that a little bit because SBA wants to make sure that there is not any control concerns. We'll talk a lot about control in a few, but basically that disadvantaged individual has to fully control the company. So where there is a potential affiliation with another company, SBA will look into that during the application and annual renewal procedures to make sure that they don't see any issues with companies controlling each other or somebody that's not the disadvantaged owner having the ability to control those companies. So important to keep those in mind. They can impact your eligibility in multiple ways. Okay, disadvantaged individuals. Just for shorthand, because it's a long word, long 2 words. We're going to do DIs. When I say DIs, I'm talking about disadvantaged, socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. And those individuals are the ones that must be the 51% owners, the ones that must show that they are economically disadvantaged. They are the ones that must control the company. When we're talking about the tribal 8As, do keep in mind DIs can be subbed for tribe. The tribe itself is the DI technically for those. So an 8A company must be owned and controlled by one or more DIs. So I get asked this a lot as well. If there are 2 individuals that qualify as DIs, they're both disadvantaged individuals, and they were to own collectively 52% of the company and collectively they control the company, do they qualify? The answer is if they want to, they can. So they could both go through the process of getting certified as a DI through SBA. And if they do so, then yes, they can collectively meet these requirements. But the problem with that, the downside with that, is SBA is very strict about one 8A company per disadvantaged individual. So if 2 people use their disadvantaged status to qualify, then those 2 people cannot go have another 8A company. Whereas if one individual who is disadvantaged does 51%, controls the company, even if another individual has some ownership, like 20%, 10%, whatever ownership in that company, as long as they don't use their disadvantaged status, they have the possible option of owning another 8A company in the future. Because 8A companies are limited in terms, that's often something people do want to keep in mind and try not to waste that status if they could have had it without needing to use that one-time qualification. So yes, must be owned and controlled. Multiple is fine. 1 is probably the preference. And then I mentioned this too, each DI gets only 1 in their lifetime, which is why you often see just 1 person qualifying the company, even if there are multiple that can. Citizenship and residency. I put a American flag and a pretty cool flag there next to it. I'm clever, sorry, just deal with it, sorry. So citizenship and residency. Citizen, US citizen, you cannot just be a permanent resident, you cannot be a naturalized citizen. I don't know a ton about immigration law or what these mean, but I do know that those are not, it has to be a full-blown US citizen under the laws of the US. You also must have the DI must reside in the United States. So in order to qualify, that's just one of the rules that SBA has imposed. There are people that have multiple residencies, some in other countries, some here. I think you essentially need to show that your primary residence is in the United States. Good character. We'll go over this one fairly quickly because it's not one that comes up a lot, really, because most of the time people know if they have, felonies in their closet and things like that. And a felony, keep in mind, is not a total death sentence, depending on what it was, when it happened, all of that stuff. But for the most part, you want to look to see if SBA will look to see if you have had any kind of suspension or debarment and significant federal debts. Usually with federal debts, as long as you can show that you do have a like a payment plan in place, then that's enough. They're not too worried about you having no debts. They just want to make sure that your debts are you're in good standing for your federal debts. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me on this. Okay, next one is social disadvantage. And I believe, I'll just say next slide if that's okay. Perfect. Okay. And I need to do some troubleshooting for Teams because Teams does not like me today. Okay, social disadvantage is the next one. This is the big one. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this one. It's very important to getting into the 8A program. It's one of the main reasons we see people denied 8A program status is typically has to do with social disadvantage. I would say the next most common would be economic disadvantage or potential for success. So we will start with the way it used to be. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the way it used to be, but it's important to kind of set that stage in your head. So the way that social disadvantage used to be was that if you could check one of the boxes for being a group that has basically been marginalized in the US. So African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, there's a whole lot of those. And it's one of those things where there was probably, I want to say like 30 different groups. And if you could check one of those boxes, generally SBA accepted that on its face. It was called a rebuttable presumption because technically SBA could require you to further demonstrate how you were involved in the group, if you held yourself out to be a member of the group. What I saw primarily in my practice was things where SBA may reach out. I had one client who was of Hispanic descent. Her mother's maiden name was I would say Hernandez, and her dad's last name was something that sounded very American. It was like Smith. And so her last name was Smith. And so they did reach out to her and asked her about her Hispanic heritage on her mother's side. And she simply had to provide her mother's birth certificate showing that her mother's maiden name was Hernandez, which was a name more generally of Hispanic descent. So things like that would be how SBA kind of policed that. But that's really one of the main issues that was raised, was the fact that for most people, there was not any kind of additional proof that you had to make. Usually, if you told SBA you were part of the group, they considered you part of the group, and you did not have to write a social disadvantage narrative. That is what we're going to talk about with the ultimate case, the decision that came down that changed things. And I think we did skip one slide, but it's absolutely fine. Just stay on this one, but I'm going to read that to you really quickly. It's just the bigger picture of what social disadvantage is. So it's described in 124.103. And it essentially says socially disadvantaged individuals are those who have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias within American society. Yep, that's it. Because of their identities as members of groups and without regard to their individual qualities. Social disadvantage must stem from circumstances beyond their control. That is just the big picture definition. If you want to go to the next slide, that one, yep, there, yep, perfect. So the rebuttable presumption was a thing, and if you did not qualify as one of those groups, there were certain ethnicities that did not qualify, they just weren't listed amongst the groups. Women, gender was not one listed amongst the groups. Disabilities, there were lots of reasons that people still wrote those narratives, but those narratives used to make up a very, very small percentage of the entire application, you know, how many people were applying. Most people were not writing those narratives. Most people were getting in based on the presumption. So again, if you didn't qualify, you wrote a narrative. I'm going to call the narrative SDN. That's a social disadvantage narrative. And so it used to be just a small number, and now it's everyone. Spoiler alert. And we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. Perfect. This is the case that came out a couple summers ago in the Eastern District of Tennessee. It is Ultima Services Corp. versus U.S. Department of Agriculture. Most of you are probably well aware of this. It was a very big case. It did a lot for not being something that changed a statute, as I mentioned earlier. It had a pretty significant effect, more so than you would expect something that's, essentially prescribed by statute to be able to be changed via regulatory changes. But it had major impacts. So the U.S. Federal District Court, so it is a district court, it's just in the Eastern District of Tennessee. It basically came down and said, there's no more presumption of social disadvantage. So this is, the court said the presumption was unconstitutional and that it violates equal protection. The case's ruling is focused solely on the presumption of social disadvantage, not other aspects of the 8A program. Again, the 8A program itself is statutory, so we can't expect a court ruling to affect the underlying statutes there, the biggest picture stuff. But again, impact was pretty significant. And we'll talk a little more on the next 2 slides. The next one is about, I believe, the facts of Ultima. Yep. So USDA did not exercise options. So, you have contract, you have the base year, and then you have option years. The USDA did not exercise the option years for this plaintiff. Ultima is the plaintiff, the name of the company. She had a WOSB contract, and she wanted the options to be exercised so she could keep the dollars, she could keep the work. But instead, the USDA said, no, we're going to award a sole source 8A contract to another company, to an 8A company. Ultima, the plaintiff, said that the rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage was discriminatory, and it discriminated against those that were not presumed socially disadvantaged in violation of the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. So what they look at there is they are saying that the distinction here between the presumed disadvantage and those not burdens a fundamental right, it targets a suspect class, or it intentionally treats a person differently from others that are similarly situated without a rational basis. This case involved race, so it's called strict scrutiny is what the standard that the court will apply. And then government actions are only upheld under a strict scrutiny standard if they are narrowly tailored and they are measures that further a compelling government interest. Okay, Ultima Court holdings. Also, oh, hey, I can request control, Pedro. I'm going to see if that way you don't have to keep changing slides. Did that work? We'll see. Okay, so for this one.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and do it.
I think it worked. Yeah, I think it worked. We'll see. If not, I'll just keep saying next slide, and I apologize. So the RPSD is what I'm calling the rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage. I'll either just call it that or I'll call it the presumption. But what the court held is that it was not narrowly tailored. It did not further a compelling government interest. And essentially, they said that SBA's expert reports and studies showed that there was systematic minority-owned business disparities. So kind of bigger picture, systematic disparities. However, they said they were not specific instances of discrimination. And they said, therefore, SBA did not show that the presumption had specific objectives. They also took a lot of interest in the fact that SBA had not considered race-neutral alternatives because they couldn't find SBA's reasoning and anything that said there was race-neutral alternatives considered. They essentially knew that they didn't consider those. They don't have those. They have to at least be considered, even if you end up deciding on the race-specific option. So they said it was not truly rebuttable. I kind of already gave you a little indication of that one. That's when they look and say, well, okay, there's really no policing of whether or not somebody does meet this rebuttable presumption. If they say they do, generally it's accepted that they do. And that's the end of the story. Most of the time, SBA is not digging into things further. So now, in the current landscape, everybody has to write an SDN. There we go. Okay, so We're going to talk a lot about the SDN. I think it's a really great subject to spend our time on. I think that it's probably one of the most difficult parts of the application process. So this is, it's a skill because it's very much a legal writing skill where you're meeting these formulas, but it's also a very personal, creative, biographical type writing skill. Having all of those skills together is not an easy thing. So everybody has to now draft the SDN, except tribal-owned entities, 8A companies, ANCs, NHOs, CDCs. They are still exempt from this requirement. I put still because the plaintiff in Ultima did attack these things, said that they should also have to write the narrative, but the court did not take it that far yet. So what is a social disadvantage narrative? How does it work? The standard of review that will be applied by the SBA. And if you were to appeal a decision on the social disadvantage narrative, it would also be the standard used by SBA's OHA, Office of Hearings and Appeals. Essentially, you must prove to SBA, it should say must prove the SBA applicant is socially disadvantaged by preponderance of the evidence. So SBA's helpful tips say that this means evidence of equality and quantity, leading the decision maker to objectively conclude the existence or truth of the facts asserted is more probable than not. Lots of words just to say more probable than not. The standard is basically more probable than not. This means you do not need a smoking gun. And keep in mind, this is often something you have to remind the SBA itself about. SBA often will ask you, well, where's proof that this happened? Where's evidence that this is exactly what happened and that it was based on your gender or whatever? And you sometimes have to remind them that's not what the standard is. The standard is more probable than not. And for the most part, not everybody is going to be able to go get proof. If someone is discriminating against you, they're not generally willing to sign something saying, hey, I discriminated against you because you're a woman. So it's one of those things where there's a reason the standard is a little lower. You just have to remind SBA sometimes that it is. The rules suggest providing as many details and relevant facts as possible, including third-party statements, accounts, or observations, and/or supporting documentation wherever possible. Again, some, not all, reviewers will demand these things, and sometimes you simply have to tell them it's not possible. We don't have all these things. So these are the elements of a social disadvantage narrative, and these are the same and have been the same since the beginning of the social disadvantage narrative. So we have the objective distinguishing feature. This is an identifiable feature about yourself, identifiable part of your personality, of your ethnicity, of your capability, your gender, your sexual preference, all these things that causes or contributes to social disadvantage. I will talk a little bit about, I think I talk about this a little more on their slide, but the objective distinguishing feature is one of the most important parts of the entire SDN process. I, for the most part, recommend picking one objective distinguishing feature or picking, no more than 2 or 3. And if you do pick 2 or 3, making sure they are tied together. What I mean by this is this. If I'm applying to the 8A program and I am a woman and I am of Native American descent, if I am going to be essentially alleging multiple instances of social disadvantage, and some of those are going to be where I was treated differently because I'm a woman, and some of those are going to be where I was treated differently because of my Native American descent. And I'm not tying those things together at all. I'm simply saying, here's 10 instances of social disadvantage. 5 of them I believe are due to being a woman. 5 of them I believe are due to being Native American. The problem with that is SBA, in my experience, and keep in mind, there's nothing in the rules that tells you not to do this. There's really no guidance from SBA that tells you not to do this. This is simply me telling you not to do this. In my experience, the more objective distinguishing features that you include, the more SBA begins to read your narrative as if it is a autobiography of all the bad treatment you've received in your life. No matter how significant and bad that treatment is, it's much harder to meet these formulas if you are using multiple objective distinguishing features. Now, if I can go through, and again, this is just from my practice, but I found it very tried and true. This is a big time tip that I give to anybody that's willing to listen to my ADA program spiel. Tying the two together. So if I can say, here's 5 instances of social disadvantage. In these 5 cases, the people treated me differently once they found out I was both a woman and of Native American descent. So let's say that they already knew I was a woman and really didn't treat me that different. But as soon as they found out I was a Native American woman, then I started being treated differently. So the key distinction here is, even if you're not 100% sure whether it was because you're a woman or because you're Native American, you're able to tie all of those together and simply argue that as a Native American woman, I am treated far differently than the Caucasian males that are standard majority of all of these things that I'm going to discuss: my education, my business history, career, employment. So when you're able to tie those together, it makes meeting the rest of this formula much, much easier. We will go into that a bit more, but I want you to keep that in mind here. We are going to talk very specifically about Puerto Rico and being a Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico, and how you might be able to kind of establish social disadvantage based on just generalities that we'll talk about. But do keep in mind, for anyone that is a woman, either living in Puerto Rico, from Puerto Rico, of Puerto Rican descent, or family has just moved to Puerto Rico, if you are a woman as well, it's worth considering latching on to the gender aspect for your application. If you can think of multiple instances where gender was a feature. And that's important because if you are, one of the things Pedro brought up that frankly I had never thought about, and I think this is one thing that makes Puerto Rico very unique, and I had not at all considered this or thought about this, and I'm very fascinated by it now. Frankly, I may even do a blog on it, and if I do, I will make sure to share that with you all. But basically, real quick, chat, Nolan, the number of recommended SDN instances, we're going to talk about that in just a second because I have some good insider info on that. So good question. But basically, if you can name some objective distinguishing feature that sets you apart, since you have a difficult task. Yes, people discriminate against Puerto Ricans. Yes, people discriminate against everybody that's, English is not their first language. Anybody of Hispanic descent, of Latino descent, all of those things are, yes, living in Puerto Rico does meet the requirement for living in the US, correct. But all of those things are ones that are going to be more challenging for those in Puerto Rico to establish. If you are a Puerto Rican whose Spanish is your first language and you live in the main states and you're applying to the ADA program, you're probably going to have a plethora of different examples where you can say, look, I was treated differently by all of these white men in the room. They all treated me differently. Those examples were probably free flowing. There's probably a lot of those. However, when you are talking about living in Puerto Rico, speaking Spanish, being of Puerto Rican descent, it's going to be more difficult to establish the elements of prejudice and bias amongst other Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico. We do have some ideas we're going to talk about, but keep in mind, if you've got gender, or if you are of a basically a minority when it comes to sexual preferences. I've now helped multiple women get into the ADA program based on them being either bisexual or homosexual. And so there's a lot of other things. So even if your brain immediately goes to the fact that you're Puerto Rican or your client's Puerto Rican, and that's probably what you're going to use to apply to the ADA program. Rightfully so that you would think that, because there used to be the boxes that you could check. It was a presumption. But now that may not be your go-to. It may be something you include, and you may be able to tie it to some instances. But if you've got an additional element there, it's also great to include that. So we have first one, objective distinguishing feature. I harped on that again. It's very important. Bias and discrimination, this is simply you showing that in American society, you've been treated differently and it is a prejudicial thing. Chronic and substantial, this is the tricky one. Somebody asked about how many instances. This is why that's a very good question, and it's a bit tricky. No matter what, yes, you are supposed to have 2. SBA has bounced back and forth though. So there was a point in time where they wanted as many instances as you could think of, as many as you had. And these narratives were getting 20, 30 pages regularly. Well, then after Ultima, one thing SBA did to try to lighten the load a little bit now that everybody had to write narratives was SBA made it so you only needed 2. You did not need more than 2. So even then I would still sometimes include a third one. I would sometimes include, additional ones if I had them. However, then SBA went to, you absolutely can only have 2. And the whole process for a little bit was just 2. In fact, there was even a Q&A type thing. We're going to talk about this too, but it was very difficult to show chronic and substantial when you could only have 2. So I will touch on where we're at now with that on the next slide, but I'm going to finish this one really quick. And then impact on entry or advancement into the economy. So this is the long-term impact analysis. So I keep in mind that for all of these, you have 1 or 2 objective distinguishing features that carries through the whole narrative. Chronic and substantial is you showing that it's not just happened once, preferably not just twice. 3 or 4 is good to show chronic substantial. Also, if you can tie instances to bigger, like something happened over the course of my education. My entire education was plagued by me being, diverted into pathways more common for women. Things like that are really great because they show more chronic and substantial. And then for each incident, that's where you then have 2 analyses. One is bias and discrimination. That's where you show why it's more likely than not that it was bias-based or discrimination-based. And then impact, one of the most important ones that people fail on all the time, that is you showing how each incident impacted you. The problem there is so much of it is common sense. A lot of people will tell you it's common sense that it hurt me that I could not, start my business sooner, that financially being paid less than a man really hurt me. But you really have to go into how that hurt you. And good ways to do that are brainstorming. I often give suggestions to my clients and then I make sure those are correct before I include them. But things like if I was paid less than a man for years in my career who was exactly equally qualified as me, saying they're equally as qualified as me is great. That establishes bias and discrimination. If we have equal education, if we have equal qualifications, years of experience, work performance, those are equal across the board. It must be based on what feature does separate us, which is gender. So I've established bias. So then I go to long-term impact. Some of the things that seem common sense, but SBA wants you to spell them out. So you would then say, for example, I had to take out more loans than others starting my business because I was paid less and had less financial security than my male counterpart. I also had a harder time getting those loans than my male counterpart. So I believe I could have started my business sooner. It could have been on its feet faster. I could have been more successful. All of this would have been so much better had I just been a Caucasian male. So good example there to keep in mind. I like that one a lot. It illustrates all of those aspects, that formula very well. So when you're identifying your objective distinguishing feature, I'm not going to go too long on this because we talked about it, but you want to pick 1, maybe 2 if related. And these are features of your identity: gender, race. The objective distinguishing feature should be uncommon to those that are not socially disadvantaged. So that's where I like to think to myself, if anybody is just deemed not socially disadvantaged, who's that going to be? Well, that's probably going to be a wealthy white male that has financial stability, that has a history of, good family history, that's been handed down land and all kind of generational wealth and has no disabilities. So I like to picture that in my head when I'm doing these objective distinguishing features, because that will give you some ideas sometimes. There's some I wouldn't think of. Long-term isolation, that's written into the rules. If you have long-term isolation in a area that basically prevents you from full immersion into the US society, that can be one. That can be a good objective distinguishing feature, that you were raised in a A good example would be like a Mormon community, or you're raised in a commune or something. Those can be features that make you unique and show others discriminate against you on that basis. More tips. So for bias, again, you have to show there's no alternative ground. There's not a legitimate alternative ground for the treatment you received. Good example, going back to the payment. Always go back to that because that's the easiest, cleanest cut example for me. If I'm arguing I'm being paid unequally, unfairly, discriminatorily to be an engineer at a firm, and my engineering counterpart is a male and he is getting paid more than me, I need to say what I told you before. There is no difference in our skills, qualifications, history, experience, any of that. Now, if one of those does exist, because it's obviously not a perfect world, sometimes you're going to have one of those, you still need to show why bias discrimination is more likely the cause than that other feature. So I would say, let's say, for example, he has a degree, an additional degree that I don't have. So to an extent, I could understand him being paid maybe a little more than me based on having this degree. A good way to kind of combat that, though, would be to come and say, but the work that we are doing has nothing to do with that degree. It's the engineering degree that qualifies us for this work. It's the degree that matters. And because we both have that, it has to be based on gender, because it can't be based on some degree that doesn't matter. So be ready to explain, even if you don't do so in the narrative. If SBA were to come back and say, well, wait a second, is there a possible physical reason? Is it like, for example, men tend to be more physically strong than women? If we're talking about heavy lifting in the job place, maybe the man's getting paid more because he's lifted more, things like that. There are legitimate physical differences and things like that. SBA just wants to hear you say why you believe bias and discrimination is the actual cause, or more likely the cause. So SBA allows you to pull from your education, your employment, and your business history. You can pull from all of those, some of those. Those are very broad categories that allow you to go all the way back to being a kid. And we do go all the way back to being a kid. I've had many times where my client's argument starts with 3rd grade, when their teacher said, you're a woman, you should be a nurse. Only men are really doctors. Things like that are said sometimes, and they can have lasting impacts on you. The important part there, it's easy to show bias discrimination there. The important part there is going to be that long-term impact and making sure you establish how it still impacts you to this day. And of course it can. So for each incident, as many details as possible. Now, if you cannot remember names, dates, locations, it is okay to be a little more general, but you still want to try. And this is the big thing. A lot of people think they can't remember specific name, date, location, that it's not really worth going into much about, just saying, you know, it happens sometime. But any details you can give are helpful. So if you say, this was sometime during spring 2025. My professor, I don't recall his name, but it was a tall man and he had brown hair and he wore glasses. He was my professor for psychology, whatever it may be. So the more details you can give, the better. But they also very much understand that people don't have perfect memories. And additionally, a lot of this stuff is really negative. It's not stuff you want to remember for the rest of your life. I've used multiple times in my narrative, and I would encourage you to do so. In my clients' narratives, we will mention that, hey, this was a painful experience. I don't recall every detail of this because I don't want to. I have not wanted to, and I have not made space in my brain for it. That's okay. Remember that you really are driving the vehicle here, and SBA might try to take you on different courses, but it really is up to you to keep them on track and remind them what matters and what the rules actually do require. So the negative impact analysis, again, very, very important. You need enough incidents to show it was chronic, but you also don't want to focus on a ton of incidents where you have a couple really good incidents. So there's a kind of a balancing act that goes on. I typically say to shoot for 3 or 4 if you can, now that we have it open to more. I don't want to go into much more than that to make sure I have time to establish everything and space to establish everything for each incident. I recently actually had one of my attorneys reach out to SBA and asked, because there is currently zero guidance out there about this. In fact, the last we heard from SBA was that you need to go into the new My Certifications portal. You need to answer yes or no questions regarding the narrative, upload a very short little, it's limited in characters and everything, blurb about the analysis of bias, analysis of impact, and then you're good. Well, we've had clients recently go in to do that, and it has changed. However, SBA has not released an updated regulation. It has not released updated guidance. There's no policy. There's no FAQ. Nothing out there. I only know this, and you're getting this benefit today through me because of my clients. My clients have come back and told me that of late, this is not what SBA wants. It is back to allowing you to upload a PDF document that is your narrative. And two, generally, it could be considered enough, but if you've got 3 or 4, shoot for 3 or 4. SBA will consider more than 3 or 4. They did also note that they do have a 10-page limit. It's not a hard and fast limit. They're not going to cut you off after 10 pages, but keep in mind a good narrative with a couple incidences that goes through all of the parts of the formula. Really, 10 pages is a very fair estimate for what that should take you. Okay, so that is social disadvantage in a nutshell. Happy to talk more about that offline. Anybody wants to email me or talk more about it. Before I jump to economic disadvantage, I will say I did some brainstorming with my colleagues, and the couple things that we came up with specific to those in Puerto Rico, because again, Pedro, a great question there, are number one, again, gender. Gender is a big one. Sexual orientation is a big one. If you can argue one of those things, it's probably going to be easier to do if you are a Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico than arguing discrimination in Puerto Rico. So that's one option. Another option, and this is, I have no personal knowledge here. This is coming from my friend who is from Puerto Rico. And so what he told me was that even within Puerto Rican society, there's a bit of a distinction, and there can be different treatment of people based on whether you were born in Puerto Rico versus whether you moved to Puerto Rico from the main states or wherever at some point in your life. So I don't know enough about this to give you perfect examples here, but I'm just going to kind of run with what my take on it is. So let's say that you work with, you and there's 3 or 4 companies that are run by individuals of Puerto Rican descent. And then there's one person is, newer to Puerto Rico. Let's say they are of, some kind of Latin American descent, but they have moved to Puerto Rico in the last 10 years or so. They may have an argument that they actually have been treated somewhat differently by others in Puerto Rico who are Puerto Rico natives, who are natural to Puerto Rico. And if that is the case, again, just being ready to explain that and how you're treated differently. The other thing is, talking about kind of family heritage. That's a good one too. Some may be able to make the argument that they came up in a more fortunate or less fortunate type of upbringing based on whether they were born in Puerto Rico to parents of Puerto Rican descent, or moved there with, the wealth to be moving around the country and moving to Puerto Rico. And then finally, I think the other big one to keep in mind, because it allows you to draw from education. One of the big things with education, I know absolutely nothing about the schools in Puerto Rico, but to the extent that you live in an area of Puerto Rico, similar to kind of like an inner city area here in Kansas or anywhere in the main 48 states, you may have an argument that your education was not as good as others based on location, like specific location issues. So if you were in kind of a quote unquote inner city in an area of Puerto Rico that was less fortunate than others, you may be able to argue we did not have the same laptops, we did not have the same books, the same resources. As a result, we absolutely were at a disadvantage. We were not given the same opportunities as others, even in other parts of Puerto Rico that were more fortunate areas of Puerto Rico, people coming from more generational wealth, things like that. And in the same way that you would argue, as a woman, You maybe were told you should do nursing instead of being a doctor because you're not male at a younger age. You may be able to make a similar argument that you were generally discouraged from, growing up and becoming a doctor because you did not have the science classes and the capabilities and opportunities that these other schools had. You may also be able to say within your own family, your parents, maybe you, for whatever reason, again, grew up in a more disadvantaged area of Puerto Rico. Maybe your parents don't have college degrees. Maybe they really didn't even encourage you to get a college degree. Maybe they told you just, go get some kind of associate's degree, or maybe just, go straight to work outside of high school because we need the money. I have written narrative for someone where they had to start working immediately out of high school instead of going to college because they had to take care of their parents because their parents were getting older and there was no financial stability. So there's a lot of different things we can talk about even in that context for education. Then for employment and business history, and you don't have to pull from all of these. Again, they could all be examples of education. They could all be examples of business history. But with your current company, keep in mind, even with you being in Puerto Rico, even with you potentially pursuing lots of contracts in Puerto Rico, where the contracting agencies are also, filled with people from Puerto Rico, filled with other Puerto Ricans. The thing that can still occur there is if you are competing, especially in this world we live in where so much work is now remote and so much work, you can be a contractor in Florida and you can do work in Puerto Rico. You can be a contractor in Puerto Rico and you can do work in New York. There can be all kinds of different locations where you're able to work based on, the fact that we now have much more freedom. And so with that in mind, keep in mind whether or not there's been situations where you went in to bid. This can be with the government. This can be with teaming partners, anything. You went in to bid on a federal government contract and you realized you were going up against 3 other companies that were all small businesses run by very privileged white men. And you can say that everybody was being treated really fairly and wonderfully. And then you all hop on a Zoom call and you immediately can tell that even the other Puerto Rican, the person who is in charge of the contracting officer, whoever it may be, starts treating you differently and kind of immediately brushes you off and starts favoring the 3 companies owned by the privileged white wealthy male. That is another great way to show that even being a Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico, you are still facing discrimination from the greater US society as a whole. Those are just some of the examples we came up with. If anybody's got specific questions, again, happy to dive in deeper via email. But I thought all of those were really great ideas to hang on to in this scenario. I think those could all be great. So I know we're pushing time a little. I'm going to kind of fly through the rest of these, but the rest of these are much more simple. And then we will have questions at the end, which I'm happy to answer about social disadvantage as well. So the other big disadvantage category is economic disadvantage. So for economic disadvantage, you want to look at 124, 104. There's a couple different tests, and SBA applies these 3 tests. You must show compliance with all 3. And keep in mind that for all 3 of the thresholds, your assets and debts that are jointly owned by spouses, if you are married, they are evaluated at 50%. There we go. AGI, this is the first threshold. This is the adjusted gross income. Essentially, this says over the last 3 years, you have an average of less than $400,000 a year in income. This includes any income in any form. The only thing that is excluded would be if you have any kind of income that's coming in from a retirement fund of any kind, which is generally not considered income, but keep it in mind. It will typically exclude your spouse's income, but do keep in mind if your spouse is involved in the company, typically if they have ownership, if they have any kind of management, if they have provided loans or anything, resources to the company, then some or all of their finances may be counted. There's not a clear, easy answer there as to how much is going to be counted, though, unfortunately. And then you would exclude any S Corp or LLC income that is used to pay company taxes or reinvested in the company. So that is a benefit there because we all know company taxes can be pretty ridiculous. If you reinvest funds in the company as the owner that needs to keep the company afloat, that can be excluded as well. And then finally, let's say that you have the last 3 years, 300,000, 300,000, and 600,000. So SBA may look at that and say, you know, well, your average does end up being higher because of this 1 year where you got 600,000 a year. But if you can explain to SBA, hey, that year in particular, I received an inheritance from my great aunt or something. That year I had sold a bunch of property that I'd been sitting on for a while. As long as you can explain to SBA why that's unusual income, unlikely to occur again, SBA will also allow you to exclude it in some cases, as long as you're just full disclosure, open communication with SBA. So that's threshold number 1. Threshold number 2, A and W, adjusted net worth is what I call it. They generally just call it net worth. I call it adjusted. Why? Because it is adjusted for 2 things. Well, also does not count the funds in your retirement accounts. None of these thresholds do. Keep that in mind. Also doesn't count the funds used to pay company taxes or reinvested in the company. Again, none of them do. But the 2 big distinguishing features of this one, of the A and W, you do not count your equity in your primary residence. If you own multiple homes, it would be the one considered your primary home that is excluded. You also do not count your equity in the 8A participants. So that's a big one too. So if you're looking at some number, you know, around $1 million is what you would say you probably have in assets. But as you go in and start looking at, and SBA looks at your financial forms and your IRS and your state tax records, and you see that, oh, okay, well, at least 400,000 of this is in a primary residence. That's not going to count. And then you look at what the company is worth, what your ownership in the company is, and you exclude that equity as well. So that number has to be below 850,000. Finally, third one, total asset threshold. This is the big catch-all, if you will. It is the total fair market value of all assets, and also called the unadjusted net worth, UNW. It only excludes retirement funds, and it does not exclude any of the other exclusions for the other ones. That has to be under 6.5 million. That one you will generally show by showing that SBA SBA sends you forms, or you download them, either way, and you fill those forms out saying exactly what your assets are and what your equity is and everything. And I talk a tiny bit about that in just a minute. I will answer this question right now. It's a good one, and it's about the question. Adjusted gross income. So we call it adjusted gross income. Yeah, there you go. Because it comes straight from taxes. There is an AGI line in your taxes, and it's essentially your total income. It's not just your income from the company. It's not just your income from one source. It's your income from all sources. So it's really good to talk to an accountant about that. But if you've got some kind of annuity that you get, you've got your 8A company, and then you've also got, I don't know, it's some other form of finances that brings you income to some extent every year. All of that is added together, and it's called adjusted simply because that's kind of the term used by taxes. And then that is where you need to look. That's the only one that's an average over the last 3 years. The other 2 thresholds are a total amount. The AGI is an average over the last 3 years. Good question. So DIs must unconditionally and directly own at least 51%. I put little Gollum there from Lord of the Rings because of he owns his precious, so holy, and that was the vibe I get on how closely SBA likes to see owners hold these companies and control these companies. So OHA has said that ownership rights must be unlimited, no restrictions whatsoever, and the owner's ability to dispose of their shares in any way they choose. That cannot be limited. That's an important one. We see that as an issue that pops up in a lot of operating agreements, where people get their operating agreements from sources that are not 8A specialized attorneys. And often it will say something like, none of the owners can transfer their assets without approval of the other owners. That's a very common standard term for a lot of operating agreements, and it's really not a problematic term most of the time. But for SBA's 8A program, it is. And that's why even the best companies out there that have the least amount of work needed to apply, I still end up making lots of changes to their operating agreement most of the time. Exceptions for certain
I always hate this word, revocable or revocable trusts, agreements dealing with the death or incapacity of a shareholder and the pledge of stock as collateral if the terms follow normal commercial practices. In a nutshell, you have to own the company directly. You cannot own it through most types of other entities. You can't own it through, you can't have a wholly owned subsidiary that's an 8A of an 8A parent. You can't own the company through some kind of non-revocable trust. And the only exception is for certain revocable trusts, and those are still ones where you would want to talk to both an accountant and a 8A specialized attorney to make sure that the terms of the trust itself support your eligibility still, because there are specific terms that would need to be in there, and they do have to follow normal commercial practices. Control is the other big ownership and controller, the two you hear together as the main kind of management requirements and ownership requirements. So you must unconditionally control both strategic policy setting and day-to-day management and administration. So basically, long-term policy, long-term strategy. If you've got a board of directors, you have to control that board of directors as the DI. And then also day-to-day management and administration of daily business operations. You have the capability to delegate certain tasks, but you really do have to show your supervisory control and ultimate decision-making power over those things. Again, that's typically done through a well-written operating agreement. If you do have a company where tasks have to be delegated, you are at least able to say, in there, you would note that these tasks are delegated to so-and-so or whatever title, but they have to kind of run decisions by me. I have the power to override any of their decisions, all of that good stuff. It's really important to just have that spelled out for SBA. It's not something you want to debate with SBA down the line. You'd rather have it spelled out perfectly in your agreements. So just a quick little list of 3 things. The DI, disadvantaged individual, has to hold the highest officer position. Again, your operating agreement needs to be very clear, or bylaws very clear about what that highest officer position is and why that position has authority over all the other positions. Keep in mind, the title doesn't really matter. It's just however you establish that title's dominance. So I've seen CEO be the highest. I've seen president. Some just say board. The board chairman of the board is the highest. Some say COO or CFO or one of those. It doesn't matter as long as you show in the agreements why that is the superior highest position. So then in the meeting minutes is typically where you would want to show, you would want to state the DI individual holding it. Often if the DI individual is known and everything, you'll talk about them in the operating agreement, but typically we don't name all the positions in an operating agreement. We don't say who's holding all the positions because then it is easier to change them if needed. But since that disadvantaged owner is typically not going to be changed, it's okay to put that one in there. I recommend holding off on secretary and everything and just doing that via meeting minutes. You need, number 2, the managerial experience of the extent and complexity needed to run the concern. That is generally shown by your resume. SBA will ask for your resume, and they will look at that resume to make sure it shows that you have experience and skill to run the company. And then you have to devote full time to the business during normal working hours. So full-time devotion does not really allow you to have other types of obligations, companies, management, ownership. If you have anything like that, you have to get it approved by SBA ahead of time because they want to see that you're working all those normal hours. Nolan, I have an entire slide about how long the application process takes, and we are getting there. 10 more minutes, perfectly. We have the perfect amount of time to get through the last couple ones. And then LLCs, generally LLCs use operating agreements, and corporations use bylaws. However, some states, you would want to look at your state laws and see what's allowed. Some states don't care what you call it. You can call it either or. But generally, bylaws means corporation, and operating agreement means that it is a LLC. So the DI and the highest officer must ordinarily be the highest paid. This counts all of your types of compensation from dividends to W-2. SBA might allow an ordinary employee to be higher paid for a certain period. We like to see that limited in time and for a good reason. So what you would basically say is, hey, we do have an engineer that we're paying more money right now to help us with the beginning of this project, but as soon as he's done, I will go back to being the highest paid as the DI, the disadvantaged owner. You also typically don't want to ask SBA if a minority owner can be higher paid, because that does kind of concern them. They want to see that the majority owner, as far as all those owners go, is the highest paid. It's easier to explain away a license or something. Limits on DI control, we're going to fly through these. SBA presumes the DI doesn't control where the DI's current or former employer or principal of it manages or owns the company. This is simply to keep people from, when they no longer have their own 8A, or when they decide they want to get 8A, they send one of their employees that has some aspect of social disadvantage out to get an 8A company. But that concerns SBA that they would still be controlling. If there's a critical license or critical financing or bonding support provided by a non-disadvantaged individual, that can be a problem, including loans. So SBA, when 8A companies get loans from other companies, they need to be very careful with the standard terms of those loans say, to make sure that does not allocate some kind of control or ownership. Business relationships indicate such dependence that DIs cannot exercise independent judgment without great economic risk. So essentially saying, that if I were to make a decision that went against something that this, for example, the loan, the company making loans to us, if I went against their wishes, that they would then, be able to kind of cut me off and tell me I don't get the loan anymore. If that's enough to cause serious problems in my company's operations, that could be seen as economic dependence. And quickly, yes, can you own more companies? So you technically can. However, with the 8A program, you have to get SBA's approval to basically have any kind of involvement in another company. You have to actually get their approval. Unlike the other ones where you just kind of have to tell them, you have to get SBA's okay that you are able to use that other company to make any kind of revenue or anything. And an important part there for meeting the full-time devotion is typically what SBA will allow is some kind of silent ownership, kind of like an investment that you have in another company. What they won't allow is you to be managing some other company pretty much full-time and managing your company full-time, because it's been said multiple times that does not really allow full-time control of the 8A. So the big last final one is the potential for success. That's basically just showing that your company has good chances of success in the private sector if admitted to the 8A program. The whole purpose here is that SBA does not want to be helping companies that are just straight off the ground startups with the 8A, giving them 8A status and everything, knowing that they may not succeed. They may just fall, like a lot of different startups do. So basically what SBA would like to see here is at least 2 years prior to your date of 8A application of revenue in the primary industry. It doesn't have to be a lot of revenue. You just need to show some revenue in that industry, your primary NAICS. SBA looks at your access to capital and credit, technical and managerial experience via your resume, record of performance on other contracts, whether you have all the licenses you need, business trends, and other factors showing potential for success. Okay, last couple slides are about the process itself. There's only a few. 8A application portal. So it used to be certify.gov. It is now certifications.sba.gov. This is called the My SBA Certifications platform, and it is 100% electronic. Expect tons of questions, SBA forms for completion, and supporting document requests. Currently, you will submit the SDN, the social disadvantage narrative, via PDF again, but it was recently changed. It used to just be a Q&A, could change again. So do keep an eye on that. If anyone's asking you, you can always check in with me. I've got clients constantly doing that. So it's good to have somebody on the inside that can tell you where we're at right now as far as SBA's format. Application tips, apply at the right time. I already talked about this one. I don't need to go back into it, but not intended for startups. Read the instructions. I know that's such a silly one, but so often the instructions are kind of brushed over when in reality, they may tell you exactly what to do on something, and that could eventually be the reason SBA does not approve your application, is you did not follow the instructions perfectly well. SBA will, I've heard them do this. They will try to kind of tie that to the fact that if you can't follow the instructions on the application, they're worried you're not going to be able to manage the, navigate the waters of the 8A program at all. So I'll allot the time and care that's needed. It takes a lot of time. If you have some kind of assistant or secretary that can help you as a business owner, that is very, very helpful. Save all the files that you're uploading in case they don't work. Save them all in a specific area so you can upload them again. Those are all good tips. Full disclosure is always the best. Giving SBA the most recent, accurate, updated documents. Often if there is a more recent version of something, they will ask you for that right away. You need to have your other owners and your spouse's financial documents and information ready as well. SBA will ask for that, whether the spouse is involved in the business or not. And then ensure your primary NAICS matches your tax returns and SAM. That's a big one. It happens all the time because the tax codes don't match up perfectly. But really all that you need is a letter from your CPA saying that the NAICS code should really be this one, which matches the contracts, matches your primary NAICS. That's very simple, one sentence long type of thing signed by the accountant is typically enough. Final tips, you must explain all of your yes answers. If SBA says, do you have an affiliate? And you say yes, be ready to explain that in great detail. DI is working fewer than 40 hours a week. That's almost always going to be a problem. But if you've got some scenario that you believe works out, if that's standard for the industry hours, things like that, just be very ready to talk about that, explain that if that's an issue for you. And then if you have, for example, somebody who's not the disadvantaged owner has access to the bank account, be ready to explain that and to show how they do not have control over anything, that it is more of a delegated task type of thing. SBA may still take issue with it. And then be ready to explain your NAICS code selection. Again, especially if it's different on your taxes, but SBA will ask for proof that that is your primary NAICS code. Having your SAM profile always updated and accurate is huge because that is what they will cross-reference. Accurately do your own math for SBA on your financial forms. Make sure that you do it and you do it again. It does not, a lot of these forms are misleading because they don't show you like, oh, here's your final total net worth without allowable adjustments. Or it will show you with allowable adjustments. It will show you it without them. So you do the math and you deduct your equity and things like that, and you see what number you come up with. That's very important to help you kind of pull those red flags before SBA does. And then ensure any assets and debts shared with your spouse are reported 50%. We talked about that. Form 413 is a big financial one. Then don't leave the other assets boxes blank. That's a big one. You need to put all big ticket items there. Jewelry, electronics, motorcycles, vehicles, anything that is a big ticket item needs to go there. It is very important. SBA does not like to see nothing there. Basic timeline, submit the application, initial review by SBA. They send you a kickback, feedback letter, additional requests. They never, in my experience, come back and just say no or yes. They come back with more stuff first. Then you revise and supplement the application. SBA accepts the complete application, and then you get a decision letter. That decision letter typically is supposed to come within 90 days of the complete application. So keep in mind, that's not until SBA says your application is complete that their 90-day clock starts. However, they also can pause that 90 days to do background checks and things like that. And SBA is not really held to any kind of penalty if it takes longer. The last average I could find was fiscal year 2019, but it was an average of 134 days for a completed application. So on average, it went well above that 90. So don't hold that too tightly. And then basically, once you're in the program, you do have to continue maintaining eligibility. You have to make sure you still adhere to all of those requirements. The only thing SBA is not really going to look at after you're in is potential for success. They've already looked at that. Once you pass that, you're good. But you still need to show participation agreement is being met. 8A business development plan is one of the goals, that you're submitting all your reports, you're doing all of your annual renewal stuff, and you're avoiding excessive withdrawals and any kind of contingent fees. Those are all disallowed from regulation. Here are the 4 handbooks. Again, 8A program. If you would like a copy, I'm happy to send you one for free. Please just send me an email, especially for dealing with my technical difficulties today. I appreciate you all a ton. It was my worst nightmare, but we'll get through. And this is our free monthly e-newsletter. You can sign up for it. It will tell you when we have new blogs and big topics that we're covering. That's our LinkedIn page. We do LinkedIn updates on all the big new rules and our blogs, things like that. That is our phone number. You can absolutely call anytime. And Rhonda is my assistant. She will set you up with a time to talk to me or tell you how to go about contacting me. And then that is my personal email. Oh, that email is wrong. I apologize. Here is, I'm putting it in the chat. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, that is the correct email. It just has, it's missing one T. So that is my email. And now if you all have questions, I will take them.
Nicole, gracias, 1.000.000 de gracias por la presentación. Ha sido, voy a hablar en español, Nicole, bien despacio, me dejas saber. Pero muchas gracias por la presentación y ahora para todos los que están con nosotros, este es el momento de hacer las preguntas. Las preguntas las pueden hacer tanto en español como las pueden hacer en inglés. Así que las personas que tengan una pregunta, por favor, solamente levanten la mano y le abrimos el micrófono. Y los que tenemos aquí en el salón, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, pues similar a esto. Marisa, ¿me dejas saber si alguien levanta la mano? Liz Howell.
Okay.
Liz, tienes el micrófono abierto.
And I'm looking in the chat to see, I know there was a couple. Let's make sure we got answers to all of your questions.
Sí, buenas tardes. Mi pregunta va dirigida porque ella mencionó algo de que si tenías una segunda compañía y eras mayoritaria en esa segunda compañía, ¿cómo entonces se recomienda si entonces pues se recomienda cambiar que en esa segunda compañía, en vez de ser la persona mayoritaria, sea el minoritario, para que no afecte la solicitud?
Nicole, you got that?
Can you, uno más, por favor?
If I am an owner, a majority owner with 51% in two companies.
Two companies, yes.
But I am soliciting the 8A program for only one of them.
Right.
Do you recommend that I switch to be a minority owner in the second company?
Okay, sorry. Yes, that was the part I was confused on. Okay, the question is whether or not you would recommend. Okay. Well, so it's a good question. And there's really not a yes or no answer, because you could technically be a majority owner in both, in los dos. The thing that will come up is the time, how much time you spend with both companies. And so for the 8A one, you absolutely, have to show majority and you have to show full-time devotion. So let's say you have second ownership in another company, it's not 8A, and you 51% of that as well. You would basically want to demonstrate to SBA that your ownership does not require a lot of your time, that your hours are still majority spent with the 8A company. And so it is easier to show that where you own less of the company. It's kind of difficult to show that the company, the second company that you run, or you own 51% of, the more that you own, the more SBA is going to expect you actually having control over that company. So that's one reason it could help to switch to being a minority owner. And then the other big thing to keep in mind, if you are a majority owner of more than one company, then you also have SBA affiliation rules to keep in mind. Those companies would be deemed affiliates. If you are majority owner of both, it doesn't matter whether you're managing or not. That is just a matter of if 51% in two companies, those are affiliates. So again, that's not always a big deal if you still remain small under the NAICS code. But it can be if both companies are larger, small companies, and if adding those together could make your company no longer small, meeting that regulation for size, well, then at that point, you would want to go down to being a minority owner. ¿Cómo se dice minority owner?
Minoría.
Okay, see, yes. So could be a good recommendation. It could be to switch to a minority ownership. It could be very helpful, but it's not necessary in some cases.
Gracias, Nicole. Okay, we have a second question.
Yes, this is Eddie. My question is regarding the requirements for the, specifically about the objective distinguishing feature that you mentioned at the beginning. Are the age and education part of it?
And so what was the last part of your question?
Okay, you will, at the beginning, you were talking about the objective distinguishing feature. So my question is, are the age and education part of it?
Oh, education, age and education?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting a little bit of feedback on that. So yes, so your objective distinguishing feature is the feature that will go across all of your incidents. So you would look at age and education. So you would look at age could be a factor. Absolutely. I have yet to make an argument to SBA based on age, but I mean, it's very possible if you were really young or if you were, much older, that you are discriminated against based on ageism. Essentially saying that, look, it is one of those things where I am younger than all of the other business owners, or I am much older than all of the business owners, and I generally get judged based on that, and people assume that I'm not as capable because I'm not as old. You could absolutely make that argument, and especially with being older, there is absolutely elements of ageism. Ageism is a very real thing, and it's one of those. I think if you were to happen to end up with an older SBA reviewer, it could be even more helpful because we know ageism is real, and very often I have clients that are in their 80s and still doing an amazing job as contractors for the federal government. But if you are talking about a construction contract and it's very hands-on, and you're an 80-year-old and you're going up against a bunch of very young people, I think that is absolutely a possible factor to include. And it's something outside of your control. That's one of the big features for a objective distinguishing feature. And going back to that part where I mentioned if you're kind of wondering whether something will work as an objective distinguishing feature, it can help to look at what is not common for people that are privileged, for people that don't typically have discrimination thrown in their face. And generally those are going to be kind of middle-aged type people. It's not going to be the youngest or the oldest. Education is a big one. Education can be used both as a source to draw your incidents from, but yes, you can 100% say that you were not educated as well as others. I think that's kind of something we touched on with the specific Puerto Rico examples as well. If you simply, hey, everything else seems pretty fair, but for whatever reason, I grew up going to a school where we just did not have the same opportunities and privileges as others. As long as you can show that long-term impact of that, you have already kind of established bias or discrimination. I have made arguments to the government before, to the SBA, what's it called, gerrymandering? Let me see, ¿cómo se dice gerrymandering? Is it just gerrymandering? Which is essentially that the lines are drawn for certain districts and voting and things like that in a way that frankly supports systematic oppression and supports poverty in some areas. So essentially the way our country has been structured is in a way that does cause certain issues with, certain areas are just going to be underprivileged. Certain areas are just not going to get the same type of opportunities and privileges as other areas. So that is there's a case somewhere that flat out said gerrymandering. And Pedro, is there a Spanish, como se dice gerrymandering or is gerrymandering? Do you know?
I don't know.
Don't know. I don't either. Okay. Well, I don't know that one. No say.
We also have Esther. Esther, go ahead.
Yeah, it does generally just mean, though, that the lines are drawn in a way that disfavors certain people, and that is based on race. And that has been well established. So that is absolutely the kind of thing that you could say is bias and discrimination. The main goal, then, the main task would be establishing that long-term impact. And with a poor education, I think that's easy to do. So I think that's a great idea.
Thank you. Esther.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. It was great to know all this information, details, all the data. I appreciate all the time you've taken to share all the experience and everything else with us. Thank you, Nicole. My question is, in terms of if I'm a woman owned business or company, I think I saw the questions there, but I'm not seeing it now. Is that a limit or is that a limitation when I'm applying to the 8A program?
It is a benefit, actually. It really is. So I'm glad you asked that, because there's one thing I was going to mention and I forgot to mention, which is the fact that SBA used to have different types of certifications for all that you had to separately go in and apply to the women programs, which are WOSB and EDWOSB, EDWOSB. And then you'd separately go in and apply to 8A, separately go in and apply to Hudson. Well, the good changes with the new portal being My SBA Certification StockUp is the fact that you now can go in and put in all of your ownership data, control data, documents, finances, everything, submit your narrative, and then hit basically apply all, and you can apply to everything. So that's great if you've already got WOSB status. There's two things I would recommend. One, absolutely try to get 8A. I have a really good track record with women applicants in particular, and we have actually, don't quote me here, but it's true, we have never failed to get a woman into the 8A program, not once. I just think it comes down to the skill and being able to write these narratives. And frankly, we do live in a society that is dominated by patriarchy. So it is more easy than you think to come up with instances. I've had multiple women clients say, oh, I don't think I've ever been treated, I don't think there's anything. And I send them this questionnaire and they answer the questionnaire. And in doing so, they realize there are incidents that have happened to them they just really didn't think about. So I think that you absolutely try for 8A. The good news there is the part of the WOSB program, the EDWOSB, the EDWOSB, economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business. The economic disadvantage showing for that is exactly the same. It's the same thresholds and everything as the 8A program. So I would also recommend going back into your WOSB application and seeking that additional economically disadvantaged, that EDWOSB status. So what SBA will do if you go in and try to add that and then apply to 8A as well, is generally it will look at what you've already submitted to get into the 8A program, and it will kind of give you a bit of a pass on some of that. It will still evaluate the additional requirements, potential for success, social disadvantage, all of that. But it won't need to go back in and ensure that you have proper ownership, ensure that you have proper control. Why? Because the control rules are the same. The 8A is a little more strict, but generally you have to pass all of the same rules and requirements to be qualified as an owner and manager of a WOSB as you do as an owner and manager of an 8A. So it should give you a leg up. And I have clients that have every single certification under the sun. So it is the more the better. Even though the SBA cannot set stuff aside specifically for multiple statuses. That's something that they came out with a case, I think it was last year, or a rule last year or the year before. So SBA can't say, for example, you have to be an 8A and a WOSB to get this work. They can't do that. Agencies can't do that either. But what it does allow, sorry, I muted myself. If you were to start competing for a WOSB contract with another couple WOSB companies, and then you realize in the process of doing so that you are also an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business, you are also an 8A, if there are at least one more economically, WOSB, one more economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business, and one more 8A company, ideally, you are supposed to be able to then say, agency, you have to set this aside further. It needs to be set aside. No longer can it be set aside for WSB. It needs to be set aside for EDWSB or 8A. So what that allows you to do then is take a competition that may have been, 20 WOSB companies and narrow that down to you and your one or two competitors. So huge benefits to having WSB and going for those extra statuses.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, it's 3:30. We don't have time for any more questions, but as Nicole was saying, she would be happy to get your questions by email, or you can always reach out to us, to the Apex to Puerto Rico, to the Apex Accelerator, and we will be more than glad to work with you. Nicole, gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.